All right, that is an essentialist variety of a goodness expresses itself mindset. It understands human nature to come first, and our job is to cultivate and develop our innate goodness. Well, especially in the modern era, arises a school of thought called anti-essentialism. A non-essentialist metaphysic thinks of the material world as just what it is, and what we call essences are really just our own constructions, our own imaginative templates that we project onto the world. So we look at human beings, we see shared traits, we generalize from those traits to something we call human nature, and then we think that all of us participate in that common nature. Well, a non-essentialist is going to say that nature is really just a projection of your imagination onto an unwieldy, diverse set of beings. Human beings, sure, but not human beings because they buy into a certain kind of nature. Existentialism is going to be my non-essentialist variety of a goodness expresses mindset. Existentialists hold that existence comes before essence. Essence is a construction that follows the givenness of our reality, our existence. What we call human nature is, in a sense, up to us. And our notions of human nature might interfere with what it truly means to exist. And our ideas of human nature, especially if we turn them into essences and then try to fit everything into those pictures, those can actually inhibit our ability to express our true authentic existence. Back to this Mount Fuji picture, inauthenticity, lack of awareness or lack of genuine existence is the problem that faces an existentialist. We are living, in a sense, false lives because we're living according to what we think is a standard that isn't really there. That kind of conformity to social constraints, social structures, produces alienation. Alienation from others because we're all trying to live by this definition which has no actual reality. And alienation from ourselves as we try to adopt a picture of what it means to be human that doesn't fit the reality. I'm not really just an instance of a generalization. I have specific, even unique characteristics that come before so-called human nature. Existence precedes essence. So my calling, according to existentialism, is to realize my true self by living authentically, expressing who I am, and coming into a self-realization of my own, perhaps unique nature. My life's meaning doesn't come from realizing the human potential that's in me. My life's meaning comes from me. I generate it as I purpose my life according to my own will and come into my own. In this diagram, I want you to notice that the green color, which represents goodness, it represents where goodness is. It doesn't just lie at the top of Mount Fuji as the self-realization of human nature. Of course, it lies on the way up because we are coming into self-realization as we are living an authentic life. And it's even down in the fog because it's an innate human quality that we have the capacity, well, for a Confucian, to realize our own innate goodness, like a spring finding an outlet, or for a non-essentialist, the capacity to live our own lives, to develop our own potential and construct our own meaning and our own life. Selfhood is the goodness that I need to find ways to express authentically. And that selfhood doesn't just arrive at the top of Mount Fuji or even along the way. That selfhood is with me from the beginning. So goodness is at the beginning, middle, and end of any moral journey that we decide to take. Seminal thinkers in the existential tradition are Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, both of them are from the 19th century, and Jean-Paul Sartre in the 20th century. Each of the three taught in his own very different way that we have the opportunity to free ourselves from inauthentic social constraints and to live our own authentic reality. Our great opportunity is a life of internal consistency versus external mere conformity to rules, to notions of essence, and so on. Some attitudes around us today that fall into this tradition, or really into an essentialist version of the tradition, are things like the myth of innocent youth, right? little babies and young children who are just darling because they're expressing their true selves. The so-called noble savage that the West sometimes projected onto the non-developed world. Without civilization, people were good. It was civilization that messed them up. It was social external constraints that tamed and alienated the noble savage from the original environment in which people had lived in harmony. You also see it in a romanticized notion of the masses or the demos, the whole society, where people just doing their own thing are in their own right good. They're expressing themselves and they're expressing human nature. You also see a goodness expresses mindset in the lifting up of ordinary people and ordinary society. Whether it's in a traditionalist form, these people are living out the human life that we have, and that's a wonderful, noble calling, or in non-essentialist form. These people are making their own way. They are finding ways to be their true selves in their own small, maybe not even noticeable ways. Ordinary heroes. I think we see a goodness expresses mindset in our culture's widespread celebrations of self-expression in all its forms. And we can find instances in the Bible where self-expression is prized, even set out as an example to imitate. Psalm 88 is a really interesting chapter of the Bible. One of the reasons it stands out so much is that it's really just a venting of the psalmist, of a cry of despair that doesn't include news of deliverance. It doesn't give you a happy ending. All it does is voice a lament from the psalmist's heart. O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you. Verse 3, my soul is full of troubles. My life draws near to the grave. I'm counted among those who go down to the pit. I am a person who has no strength, like one set loose among the dead. Verse 6, you've put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy on me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. And then in verse 13, the psalmist goes back to voicing that he's calling out. But I, O Lord, I cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? Afflicted and close to death, from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I'm helpless. Your wrath has swept over me. Your assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me together. You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me, and my companion is darkness. Psalm 88 does not have a happy ending or a happy middle or a happy anything. Psalm 88 is just the anguish of a tormented soul. It is a great relief to many who are suffering simply to voice their suffering. Psalm 88 turns out to be something that people who are suffering depression, anxiety, etc. can hold on to. At least it validates their feelings. At least it gives them a way to voice before the Lord their misery. They find in Psalm 88 authentic self-expression, a self-expression that needs to happen in order for them to endure, let alone hope for something better. You see a similar validation of self-expression in the book of Job, where God condemns Job's friends for not having spoken truly, but validates Job. You have spoken truly. Even when Job crosses the line with God, he has crossed it in good faith, you might say. He has been true to himself. He has refused to take on a narrative about him that he can't share, that he knows isn't true. And so his self-expression is rewarded even in God's rebuke. God maintains the relationship and affirms it, and ultimately vindicates Job and restores him. What are some of the frustrations that come along with a non-essentialist goodness expresses itself mindset? Well, we're broken, and frankly, we're often boring. So when we express ourselves, sometimes the results are disappointing. There's not a lot to celebrate when we bare ourselves, especially to ourselves. When we get to express ourselves, when we're driven to express ourselves. Often at the end of that, we are faced with the fact that our self-expressions haven't satisfied. They haven't satisfied us. There are miserable actors, musicians, artists, writers, whose self-expressions have not made their lives rich and satisfying. I mentioned Ecclesiastes already, which points out the pointlessness of a life trying to fulfill your human potential if the end result is the graveyard. Well, that's equally true of existentialism. We can spend our lives constructing meaning, but we haven't really tapped into genuine, lasting meaning. All we've done is, to quote Steve Jobs of Apple Computer, we've put a dent in the universe. We've left a mark. But does that really matter? There's also the frustration that breaking out of social constraints to express yourself can only really be done productively in an environment that's shaped and made peaceful and maintained by those social constraints. Resisting social structures, even pointing out the absurdity of the social structures, turns out to be parasitic on at least some form of social structure itself to allow us to maintain it. In a medieval court, the court jester can poke fun at the different actors, poke fun even at the king, but can only really do it because that's his job. He's employed by the king. You can't really live as if you have the power to construct your whole reality. Like a comedian can make fun of reality, but that depends on a reality to make fun of. Another frustration of a goodness expresses mindset is the irony that even if you live authentically to yourself, you're going to get feedback from others. Punk rock in the 1970s became a look in the 1980s, and you had to conform to the look of what? Non-conformism? It didn't make sense. Heavy metal bands are another example of a self-assertive, reality-constructing resistance to the norm. But heavy metal bands took on a look. In the 1980s, they all became hair bands, and they all ended up looking the same. Non-conformism keeps becoming a new source of conformism. So try as we might to live authentically to our unique selves, we keep yielding to social expectations that look like the old social expectations, except maybe with just a new fashion or a new look. This, I think, is how the hippies of the 60s became the yuppies of the 1980s. And both of these expressions demonstrate that it's too simple to look at human nature as merely an expressed self that precedes one's own essence. The hybrid notion of human nature in Freudian psychology, an id as well as a superego, is just as much of a source of frustration here. Only the frustrating part is the superego. It's the rational structure that interferes with the id. We don't just have ids that need to express themselves. We have superegos that are rational, that stand outside of ourselves. So in all these ways, existentialism hasn't really turned out to be a durable notion of goodness. A non-essentialist idea of goodness expressing itself doesn't seem stable. It doesn't seem to last. Either it consolidates into a culture which has its own structures and conformities, or it burns out. So it yields to shortcuts. In the same way that hypocrisy was one shortcut for essentialism, hypocrisy is a good shortcut for non-essentialism. I can just take up identities and drop them as I will. We see a lot of that in social media. I'll just try on an identity, and when I'm done with that, I'll just try on another one, and another one, and another one. Well, am I expressing myself, or am I just burying myself under a series of projections? There's the shortcut of posing as authentic so that I get the social rewards of looking authentic in a culture that rewards it. That's just another form of conformism. I can also take the shortcut of just yielding to my impulses, to fleeting desires that might change minute to minute, and calling that self-expression. I can just indulge my impulsivity and call it authenticity. Well, that's not what Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Sartre are talking about, but it's a shortcut that's available and widely taken today. Since I'm living in a world of social structures and constraints, and since in fact my life probably depends on those structures and constraints, which allegedly I don't believe in because they're inauthentic, I can split the difference by being physically in the world but mentally out of the world. I can appear conformist, but in my own mind be truthful only to myself. I can act one way, but live in a kind of inward, private authenticity where I realize it's all really meaningless. Well, that's an incoherent life. It's a shortcut. It's also deeply cynical, and it tends to degrade the character of people who live that way. People who are PMO, physically in, mentally out, aren't happy about it. They would love to be released from that pressure and live a more truly, publicly coherent, authentic life. A final shortcut around a goodness expresses mindset is nihilism, the belief in nothing, the denial of any transcendent value, whether it's external in an essence of some sort, or whether it's internal in my own existence. Nihilism is just the denial that anything finally matters. It's the pointlessness of the book of Ecclesiastes, minus the God who might point a way beyond that nothingness. It's what John Paul II and a number of other popes have called a culture of death, a culture that is fascinated by the end of existence because it's found existence itself unbearable. There are other shortcuts that you're familiar with by now: indulging passions, indulging whims, idolatry, right? Finding something greater than ourselves and bowing down to it as the ultimate thing. That can happen just out of exhaustion from the inability of a goodness expresses approach to satisfy. It can also arise out of finding out that there are bigger things than just ourselves if you're a non-essentialist. Okay, we've looked at 6 visions of goodness, and you've been patient. I've noted some common categories here: features, examples of each school of thought, frustrations, and shortcuts. And we'll return to those. I've also noted here and there, and I want to point out that all of these make something ultimate. They put something above everything else. And they also put a way to that something before everything else. Whether that ultimate something is results, or justice, or being, human nature, or existence, or excellence. And whatever our vision of goodness puts first, whatever is ultimate, shapes the rest of our priorities accordingly. Here's something I also want to point out that I'll return to. Again and again, I've used biblical examples for each of these schools, and I intend that to be a little confusing because I've used them both positively and negatively. And I can imagine the question, well, Professor, won't you be telling us which one of these visions is the true and biblical one? Well, no, actually, I have something else in mind. I think a true vision of goodness, a satisfying and more fully biblical and Christian vision of goodness, I think lies beyond any one of these 6 visions. So my task is not going to be to tell you which one of those to embrace and neglect the others. After all, each of them comes with frustrations, each of them tempts us to shortcuts, and I think that means each of them points us beyond itself to something greater. Before we go there, before you move on, I have a few exit questions to ponder. Where do you see these visions and logics around you? Where do you see people motivated out of a goodness merits mindset or a goodness gets mindset? And where do you see these visions in you? What's motivating you? Is one of these visions of goodness dominant in your life, in your imagination? Or is it dominant in your societies? Have you been raised to think along those lines by your culture? Or maybe is more than one of them competing for your loyalties? Or does your society reflect a combination, maybe even an incoherent, tense combination of these competing notions of goodness?